This is Kenya's biggest conversation, the Situation Room. We broadcast this on every morning, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Spice FM, 7 to 9. We are also on KTN Home, but we're also online throughout the show. Spice FM KE on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, and spicefm.co.ke. So let's come back to the issue of what's happening in Africa, and this is in terms of debt. So there has been a story about Zambia. A 30-day grace period for Zambia to settle the coupon it missed on its 2024 note ends in the middle of November. This is Africa's second largest copper exporter. This is a story that has been unfolding, and one of the journalists that has been following this up is Ramah Nyang. He's a journalist with the Bloomberg and CGTN. This is a China Global Television Network. And if we just piggyback on the conversation that we were having earlier on Kenya and what we are calling a looming debt crisis. And then now you see, so we get to Zambia, and they are at a position where what they're finding is, first, they were supposed to have remitted some money. They missed that. Now they've been given until mid-November. They're trying to have a conversation on what should happen. The bigger question is, if then Zambia defaults, how concerned should the rest of Africa or sub-Saharan Africa be about the contagion effect? Is there likely to be a contagion effect? Let's bring in our guests. This is Ramah Nyang. Good morning, Ramah.
Morning, Eric. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Good to have you on the show. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you very much. It's a place I worked at many years ago, well, the parent company anyway, so it's interesting.
It's the same building, Ramah.
Same building, same company. Yeah. Anyway, talk to me. What's up?
Indeed. So, just give us a brief about the Zambia situation. What is it that's happening in Zambia? What happened?
Okay, so Zambia was, for a very long period of time, one of the darlings of the Eurobond market. They were among the initial wave, if you will, of African countries that went into the international credit market and said, hey, we'd like to borrow some money, long term, usually 7, 5, 10 years. And the markets responded pretty well. So they borrowed, as of now, roughly $3 billion. And the problem that they're facing at the moment is that they have borrowed all this money. And the premise was, well, we're in the middle of a commodity boom. A lot more people are importing our copper, and copper is the biggest single exporter, the second largest exporter of that particular commodity. And the underlying assumption was that copper revenues would just keep going up and up and up and up. And they would therefore have the money they need to continue servicing these Eurobonds that they issued. Problem is that didn't work out as planned. So they missed a payment on their 2024 Eurobond.
Mm-hmm.
That was about $42.5 million that was supposed to actually go out. And the problem now is that the way these Eurobonds contracts, if you will, are structured, if you miss a payment, you get a grace period of, say, 30 days. And that 30-day window ends on the 13th of November.
Mm-hmm.
So unless they can find that $42.5 million between now and November 13th, they're basically in the hole. And that comes with all sorts of issues.
Ramah, what are we talking about here? When we say missed a payment, it's not, we're not talking at national level now for a country. Are we saying that, they've gotten 22.5, for example, they're looking for 20, or the situation is so bad that they've not been able to get any of it at all? And it's not that we need a little bit more time, it's that it's bad, we don't have it. What are we looking at?
Essentially, that's it. We don't have the money. So if you look at the reserves, you could look at the reserves and say, yeah, but they could just take the money out of the reserves, what reserves they do have, and pay off their creditors again or holding the Eurobonds. But the fundamental problem with that is that you're basically leaving them even more vulnerable to other financial shocks. If you look at their currency, I know in Kenya we've been complaining about the Kenya shilling moving from 100 to 108, 109 in some cases on the interbank market. Zambia, the kwacha has moved from 10 to the dollar. It's almost to 21 to the dollar now. So that's a 50% shift in barely a year, which is insane. It will be the equivalent of the shilling moving from 100 to 200. Almost 200 shilling. Now, you can imagine the inflation effects pass-through that you have just from that. It's chaotic. You don't want to have that. So Zambia is in a pretty hard place because remember the same things that we're seeing here with when you introduce restrictions on movement, you're trying to limit movement in order to deal with this pandemic. So people are working fewer hours, they're making less money, businesses are cutting jobs. What that means for you as from a macro level is that you're a finance minister, and if you expected $10 billion to come through in tax revenue, you're now looking at 8 or 7 or $6 billion. So you have to do a lot more, for lack of a better word, with a smaller pot of money. And in this instance, what they've decided, what they basically went and told Eurobond holders was, listen, we have other priorities, so you guys will have to wait.
How did it get here? I asked this question because then it shines a light then on how easy it will be for other countries to get here. How did they get to the point whereby you're getting this credit on whatever platform you're getting it, and then you're getting to the point whereby unable to pay, unable to finance this? How did this happen?
A combination of things. Hubris is usually right at the top of it. The thing we have to remember is that if you go back to let's go back to 2008, right? Global financial crisis. So banks decide, central banks around the world decide, you know what, we need to make credit as cheap as possible. So they drive down the effective rates that you can find on bonds in other markets, in the UK, in the US, in Germany, in France, and so on and so forth. Now, the net effect of that is if you're a bond manager or fund manager in the UK, in the US, or wherever, essentially what that means is you're sitting on, say, a portfolio of, 20, 30, $100 billion, and you're looking for yield. And all you're going to find is, if you go into the bond market in your domestic country, you're going to find people are saying, well, we're going to lend money to you 10 years at, say, 2%. You're barely making a return. Then along comes a country like Zambia or Kenya or Ghana, and they say, we'll borrow from you for 10 years, but we'll pay you 8% or 9% or 10%. It's a very attractive proposition.
You jump on
so
it.
on one hand, you've got people who want to lend money because they're looking for yields, and that cash was there, it was available. And then on the other end of the equation, you've got all these African countries that are coming up with interesting growth stories. They need to invest in infrastructure. So for a long time, it looked like this was a match made in heaven. The problem was, at least on our end, as African countries, we tended to premise this borrowing on one never-ending growth, which is not ever going to be realistic in the first place, and Kenya is making essentially the same mistake. We also premised it on the assumption that the prices of commodities would remain high perpetually forever, which is not the case. And Zambia made those two key mistakes. So eventually, when the cows came home, proverbially speaking, they were in trouble.
Let me ask this question. Given that Zambia isn't the first country on the planet to have such a problem, what happens when you actually default? Okay,
so first of all, you get essentially you might have what they call cross default clauses in your debt contracts, which partly explains why Kenya didn't go into the debt service relief initiative that was offered by the G20. Because the instant I say, okay, Eric, I borrowed money from you, but I'm not going to pay you because I'm having some sort of financial distress. In some instances, other creditors can come in and say, hey, we want our money back, all of it, right now, which is a problem. So essentially, it would mean, like in Zambia's case, if now you missed this $42.5 million payment, does it therefore mean that the rest of your $3 billion of outstanding Eurobond debt is now immediately callable? That's something we're still trying to figure out because I haven't gone through all the Eurobond contracts, but it's a risk. It also essentially would mean that you'd be locked out of future, of essentially credit markets in the future, because once you've proven that you're an unreliable lender, or rather an unreliable borrower, why would anyone lend money to you again? Which is deeply problematic. Now, it's not quite as bad as what Zimbabwe right next to is facing, but it's kind of close, because at that point in time, if you've already defaulted on commercial loans, if you approach any other multilateral institution or a commercial bank or syndicated facility, they'll tell you, yeah, but you didn't pay these guys. Where should we lend your money?
What do countries use to secure these loans? I mean, apart from just their good record and their credit rating, what else do they use to secure these loans?
You're touching on the heart of something else that right at the middle of the dispute Zambia is having right now with Eurobond creditors.
Mm-hmm.
Because essentially when you're lending as a country, or rather when you're borrowing as a country, you're not ostensibly saying, hey, listen, in case I default, I will give you X. Because that raises a certain level of concerns about sovereignty. And the problem right now, at least in the global credit market, is that a lot of people remember what happened to Sri Lanka when they borrowed a lot of money from China, and eventually when they couldn't pay back most of it or service it properly, China eventually got a lease on a port, I think it's on the southern end of the island, it's called Hapatuta.
Yep.
And one of the main concerns that keep coming up when you talk to guys who actually bought into these Eurobonds is why are we as Eurobond holders being told that we should essentially not take this money, we should be essentially last in line, but are we getting the same treatment as bilateral lenders as well?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not treating all of us, the argument is this, if you're not treating all of us at the same way, on the same level, then realistically, there's a problem. Either we all get treated the same, therefore we all don't take payment, or we essentially just blow this whole thing up and say, sour. Right? If we're not getting paid, no one else gets paid.
No one should get paid.
Okay, so we're getting to the time where November 13th is 3 days away.
Yeah.
Right? It's 2 days from where we are now. Suffice to say that probably nationally they're looking at staring down the barrel of the gun at this point. But what essentially, so 13th comes, you miss the payment, it's not going to happen. And right now negotiations are going on for reprieve of such. What is the likelihood that the reprieve will be given?
Not likely.
Okay.
Not likely. The Eurobond holders that we've spoken to are basically saying, look, one, there's a lack of transparency, because one of the things that has always hovered around Zambia, and one of the reasons why everyone's been viewing this as a question of when, not if, was that Zambia wasn't 100% transparent with the amount of debt that they have on their books, where they sourced it from, and at what cost.
Okay.
So, for instance, in the same way that here we had our legislators have to hold hearings in order to figure out some of the basic details around the SGR contract.
Yep.
How much did you borrow? At what price? How was that particular loan structured? Was it commercial? Was it non-commercial? Zambia has that, but supersized. So the problem now is that Eurobond holders are saying, hang on, you want us to just sit back and take you at your word and say, okay, yeah, sure, it's fine. Yeah, you're in the middle of a crisis. Sawa, we'll give you some time to get your things in order. But are you treating us the same way as China? How much debt do you have relative to China? How much have you borrowed from them? How much, at what terms, what rates? Those are things that they still have not been told to date. And all that the finance minister has said so far is, and I'm quoting him here because this is what he said, he told Reuters yesterday, we're doing everything possible. The discussions with bondholders are on a continuous basis. But there's such a lack of detail. Exactly. There's such a lack of detail. Eurobond holders are just looking at this and saying, boss, you're not serious.
But is there a level playing field within which those who lend money treat those who've borrowed? For instance, like in 2015 when Greece defaulted on their debt. Is this the manner in which they were treated? There was restructuring of the loans, etc., etc. I'm asking, when third world countries default on their loans, are they given similar treatment, or does that depend on the details of the contract that they got themselves into?
So there's two answers to that. It depends, one, on the contract that you entered into. So if a government has not made the full nature of those contracts public, you've got a problem. Because you might have inadvertently signed up to a clawback clause or an immediate payment clause in case of a cross default, and your taxpayers, essentially your employers, do not know. So it's the equivalent of your husband has basically mortgaged the house. he defaults on it. You wake up in the morning and you find auctioneers at the gate.
Yep.
And you're wondering, hey, why are you taking my house? Legally, the auctioneers are right.
Yep.
Your husband signed away the rights to the assets. But here's the other side of it. The IMF, the problem that we're confronting now, unlike the last debt relief initiative that we had in the early 2000s with HIBIC, the challenge we're facing now is that if you look at the composition of debt that a lot of countries like us and Ghana and Zambia are holding, is that in the year 2000, a big chunk of it was either bilateral debts or we owed money to the IMF and the World Bank. Right? So it was fairly straightforward to get all these guys in the room and say, this is the problem, this is how we're going to solve it out. Today, you've got so many more players. So in Kenya's case, like a third of our debt is commercial. So that's a mix of Eurobonds, which gets a lot of attention. There's another part of it that doesn't get a lot of attention, which is a lot of commercial syndicated debt from the likes of Trade and Development Bank and so on and so forth. Then, of course, you've got your bilateral sources of debt, your Chinese, your French, your Japanese, and so on and so forth. And you've got the multilateral development institutions, ADB, IMF, World Bank, and so on. Now, dealing with a combination of the World Bank and the IMF plus some of the G20 guys, the Paris Club members, that's fairly straightforward because we've been here before. The difference now is that you've got China, which is our biggest single bilateral lender. We owe them something like $6.8 billion as of end June. And then you've got this massive amount of money that we owe in commercial loans. So between those two, they've got widely different methods of dealing with default. And that is where the problem is, because it isn't immediately clear in the event of a default or even debt distress, because now we're essentially at relatively moderate to high distress, depending on which triggers you want to look at. In the event of a default, it's not clear how you would actually restructure that debt facility that you hold to all these different individual creditors. And that's the problem.
Okay.
It sounds like, one of those that the dominoes just start falling and they don't stop until the final one just drops.
Because it's very hard to get off the train once you've gotten it, get on top of it. Because now we are at, let's see, if you just look at what our debt service is costing us as a percentage of what we're raising in taxes, you're basically close to 49%, looking at the last reports from the Parliamentary Budget Office.
Yep.
So for every 100 shillings we're getting, about 49 of that is just going to service a combination of principal and interest costs for local and foreign debt. Now, we're in the middle of this crazy pandemic where people are losing jobs, people are working fewer hours, businesses are downsizing. So the available tax revenue is just shrinking.
Yep.
The walls are closing in on us. And if we don't get ahead of this, we've got a problem.
But the problem here, as I see it, is that, okay, Zambia is one country, but the other countries who are in similar problems and have been since this year began, we're talking about Argentina, Ecuador, Lebanon. Now, let me ask the question. There are those who do the sort of ratings for these things, people like Fitch. Are they called Fitch? Fitch rating? Now,
Fitch, S&P, and a few others.
Yes, if I'm to go by what the CNN business indicated in May, 29 more countries are expected to actually default. So what happens now if, say, that number increases and more people default?
Well, you're going to look at the debt crisis. There's no way of sugarcoating it, which is why you hear the IMF in their last annual meetings are talking about trying to set up a new framework for dealing with default and debt distress, especially for countries like Zambia.
Okay, so we're looking at the second largest copper producer on the continent. In terms of potential to be a powerhouse, Zambia has it. But then we're looking at a situation that could essentially crumble the country, whereby they will be looking at unbelievable rates of inflation, where we'll be looking at almost total devaluing of their currency. And we're watching it happen. In terms of rescue, is there anything possible? If we're looking at the African continent alone, is anything possible?
I mean, on paper, yes. It's entirely possible for some other country to step in and say, hey, here's we can work out some sort of arrangement where we give you some breathing room. So we perhaps provide that if it's just servicing the interest, it's $42.5 million. That's not exactly a lot of money for some of the countries in the neighborhood. Problem is, a lot of those countries that could potentially step in are also facing their own issues.
Yeah.
On paper, you could say South Africa could step in and help, but then the question becomes, okay, they'd help why? They've got their own issues to deal with. So, on paper, a lot of these things can be done, but just even looking at the history that we have on the continent of trying to solve our own problems by ourselves, we tend to respond when the crisis has already hit, not before.
Right.
So if there is likely a response from African central bankers, from African finance ministers, at best, I think it's going to be after someone has already gone down. Because until that point, the thing is, this is 2020. HIPIC is, when HIPIC 1 happened, I was in high school. Right? So for a lot of us, it's this bizarre thing that, no one's ever really had to deal with in our lifetime. Even policymakers that are around today might have had to deal with our last structural adjustment programs in the 90s.
Yeah.
In primary school back then. But that institutional memory that, hey, if you screw around with debt service, it'll come back and bite you hard. That institutional memory seems to not be there. And that's fundamentally problematic because it means that we are now behaving in such an indisciplined manner when we go out there, borrow this money, come back and do virtually nothing with it.
Are you seeing like our government, for example, is taking lessons from what's happening in Zambia, from what's happened in other African countries or in other parts of the world? Are those lessons sinking in at our national treasury?
Yes and no. What we know is that Treasury has been working, or rather talking to bilateral creditors for most of this year, trying to either restructure some of the debts that we have on a bilateral basis. So this is separate from the G20 Debt Service Initiative. But to date, we haven't seen anything concrete coming out of those talks just so far. If you go back to 2015, I remember it was probably either his first or his second press conference, the central bank governor said something pretty interesting because he gave this analogy where monetary policy basically has its foot on the gas. Has its foot on the brake. And fiscal policy, so the guys at Treasury, have the foot on the gas. Then they just want to spend. Right? And usually what you want is a situation where these two elements are working together. And at that point in time, they were in complete opposition. And this is when he came in his first term as governor. And he recognized the problem from day one. Which is why if you look at some of the comments he's been making over MPC press conferences over the years, he's consistently been on message saying, look, you can't just borrow your way out of a crisis. So there are bits of government that do recognize that there's a problem and they're working on it, but there's still a lot more stuff that we can do. So for instance, transparency is one of the key concerns that keeps emerging in all of these conversations we're having. And we're not doing particularly well on that. So if it's a question of saying, this is our debt register, this is who we owe money, this is what we borrowed, on what terms, this is the price of the debt. And in the event that we default, here's what's happened, and these are all the contracts that we signed.
That transparency is not something that's forthcoming. Ramah Nyang, business journalist with Bloomberg and CGTN, that's China Global Television Network. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Eric.